Hello there, and welcome to another episode of your favorite true crime podcast, TheKillFile. This week, I am giving my listeners another sneak peek into the bonus content of The Kill File called The Hidden Files. This episode is all about the life, crimes, and death of a man notoriously known as the town bully. I will see you guys next week for another regular episode of The Kill File, and I hope that you guys enjoy this very special story from The Hidden Files. Happy listening! Welcome to The Hidden Files, an extension of your favorite podcast, The Kill File. Here we will cover different stories and cases than we normally would. This is the place where we will get to learn about various people and places in a setting that will be a little lighter than the dark corners of true crime. Get ready for a wild journey into some great tales with twists, laughs, and commentary from yours truly. Hello, and welcome to another installment of The Hidden Files, an extension of your favorite true crime podcast, The Kill File. Before we jump into today's case, a few quick reminders. First, please take a second to rate, review, subscribe, follow whichever your app needs for the newest episodes every Monday of The Kill File, and it also helps to boost the podcast on the lists for others to find. Next, check out the website, thekillfile.com, where you can find the merch shop with all of the fun true crime gear, but also you can fill out the listener files if you want to share yours or someone you know's real-life true crime story. It doesn't have to be a big crime, and it doesn't have to be long. Dark or light, serious or funny, tell us about it by submitting the form on the website or email thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com. Lastly, don't forget to follow The Kill File on social media for weekly updates and photos. We are on Blue Sky, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, so check us out. That's it for business talk. Let's talk about today's case. Today, we are going to talk about a bad man, a town bully named Ken McElroy. Trigger warnings for today are going to be domestic violence, domestic rape, rape of a minor, and murder. Here we go. Today's story is going to take us to a place called Skidmore, Missouri in the year of 1981. Skidmore is said to be a small farming town where the census from 2024 was around 232 people. Yeah, very, very small. According to people who currently or have lived there in the past, Skidmore is a quiet town with a community that is close-knit. I can only imagine how close the people who live there are. I'm sure if it's like any other small town, you either love it or maybe you were born there and you want to get the fuck out. Every year, Skidmore has an annual festival that started back in 1899 where people engage in pie-eating contests, barbecue showdowns, horseshoe competitions, and in something called the Pumpkin Show. Although small, there have been a few things of note to come out or happen in this area. In 2001, a 20-year-old resident of Skidmore named Branson Perry, who was said to be putting some jumper cables away in his yard, had completely vanished. According to an AI overview of this case, it's still unsolved to this day. Another incident of note was something that most of us may be familiar with, which is the murder of Bobby Jo Stinnett back in 2004. Now, this was the case where a pregnant Bobby Jo was murdered as her unborn baby was cut out of her womb and snatched by a woman named Lisa Montgomery. The baby lived and was seemingly unharmed except for maybe a small cut to her face, if I remember correctly, but I guess Lisa had been lying, saying that she was pregnant, and this was not the first time. When the time came for her to quote-unquote give birth, she needed for one reason or another to produce a baby, and the scheme she came up with and the way it played out was horrific. Poor Bobby Jo lived in Skidmore when Lisa came from a town in Kansas and brutally attacked and murdered her. So, besides today's story, there have been quite a few strange happenings, it seems, in this little area of Skidmore. Today's story is going to be a good reminder of why you don't want to be a douchebag in life. Our story begins on July 10th, 1981, with the murder of a man walking out of a bar called the B&G Tavern, where a small group of people would follow him from the tavern to his truck. The people would sort of gather around the truck where Ken McElroy and his wife Trina had just sat down when, bang, 3 shots rang out, all hitting Ken in the head. With over 40 witnesses to the crime, no one had seen a thing. Ken Rex McElroy was born June 16, 1934 to parents Mabel and Tony McElroy. Mabel was said to be only about 14 years old when she was married to Ken's father Tony, who at the time was about 20. Gross. The couple would go on to have 16 children, starting with their first son, who was born just after Mabel had turned 15, this being Ken's older brother, Herschel. How does one have time for that many children, or even have the ability to carry so many. Wow, that poor young girl turned woman at some point must have had quite the life with her 7 boys and girls. It was said that her and Tony had lost some twins between all of their kids. At the time that Ken was born, the family was living in the Ozarks and had bought a sizable farm to plant crops, mainly corn, and although it started off lucrative, the McElroys would end up losing their entire crop or harvest one year due to the weather in the area. The McElroys were said to live a rougher lifestyle, never having a home that actually had electricity or even running water. Tony would make his living doing something that one day would turn into being a truck driver. He would be paid to haul loads of whatever on his wagon and with his horses. Mabel was said to have been the one who was at home with the kids. She would spend her days doing mom things, of course, which couldn't have been easy for 16 kids. Can you fucking imagine the chores? The laundry? How do you feed that many children? Eventually, the family was forced to move from the Ozark area and went up north not far from Skidmore. When they had settled, it was reported that Tony would be hired to help on various farms because he seemed to have some strapping boys that would be able to help him as well, and that's what the family did for quite some time. The boys would grow up working on various farms with their father. Child labor at its finest. But this was the way it was back then. People worked hard just to scrape by, and clearly with no birth control, they had to somehow feed their children, right? From what I gather, it seems like Ken McElroy always had this sort of chip on his shoulder, to the point where even people in his own family seemed to want their distance at times. Some speculated that it was from the fact that his father seemed to adore his younger brother, the baby of the huge group, but others thought it could be due to having to work so hard in a larger family where maybe they weren't even noticed much as children. It's said that Tony often yelled at Ken for not doing things well, which happens to us all. I didn't read anything about abuse necessarily, but let's keep in mind that he was born in the 30s, which can sometimes mean that just parenting alone can now be considered abuse. It just wasn't talked about. While Ken was in school as a kid, he was said to have not always been the best student. He wasn't really a joiner, and he didn't seem to fit in well with the other kids and ended up being held back twice in just 5th grade alone. Instead of playing sports or joining clubs or anything else that most kids did as after-school activities, Ken found pleasure in trapping rodents and other small animals and raising his beloved coonhound dogs. I went down a little rabbit hole here trying to figure out if a coonhound, which is known for tracking raccoons, hence the name, is the same thing as a regular hound. Turns out that a coonhound is just a subtype of the greater breed of hound, for anyone who's curious. So because Ken had been held back for 2 years, he was huge compared to the other kids, and he knew it. He was known to have bullied the other kids, as in whatever he says goes, and the other kids knew right off the bat not to mess with him and give him what he wanted. Ken was also known to be somewhat of a klepto. He took what he pleased, and he seemingly didn't care for the consequences. There was an incident once where Ken and another kid had stolen a few items from a gas station, and the man who owned it caught them and called their dad to tell him what happened. This may give you some insight as to where the ideas of him being an untouchable came from. Later that day, Tony, their father, went to the gas station with a big knife, shoved the man against a wall, and told him that if he ever laid a hand on his kid again, that he would, quote, cut your heart out. I mean, I don't know the whole story, so if the man put a hand on Ken in a way he shouldn't, I could totally understand telling this man to fuck right off, but I also didn't read anything about how he handled that situation with his son. This is my personal opinion, but I could see bringing your son to the store to make him apologize or disciplining him in some way for the theft, and then maybe without him knowing, threatening the store man for putting hands on your kid. That would make sense to me, especially back then. I'm sure threatening wasn't considered as big of a deal as it is now. But I'm unsure how Tony handled the situation with his boy other than that, and knowing how Ken turns out later wouldn't surprise me in the least if he didn't get in trouble at all. Ken would grow up with a buddy who he seemed to be very close with, a man named John. They were both known to have gotten into petty trouble stealing, riding their horses wherever they wanted without permission, and even both dropped out of school around the same time. Stealing things from local farms and either selling them or taking whatever they could from a sitting tractor like the gas in the tank is kind of how John and Ken lived. Rather than working, they would take and use what they could. There was said to be, according to a book written about this case called In Broad Daylight by author Henry N. McLean, which, by the way, was the longer version of the story with a ton of details and seems to be very well written if you're interested. There was once an incident where Ken's truck had broken down, something to do with the transmission, and instead of fixing it or working to save money to fix it, John and Ken would find another vehicle exactly the same and when the owner was away, they snatched the transmission out of it and put it into the broken truck. At just 18 years old, when Ken would go on to marry his first wife, a young lady named Oleta, who was from St. Joe, which is just like an hour north of Kansas City on the Missouri side. After the couple was married, they would move to Colorado, where Ken's brother-in-law was able to get him a job in the construction field. Sadly, Ken and Oleta were said to have had a baby around this time, but the baby would be born deceased, which is just awful, I think, for anyone, regardless of who they are. Now, while he was working in Colorado, there would be an accident on the job site that would affect him for the rest of his life. I guess something big, I didn't quite understand what it was, but it fell from about 30 feet above him at the work site, hitting him in the head, and it must have been pretty large because it broke his safety hat and even split his head open. This would end up causing him problems with his nerves and muscles in the neck area, and he would claim that this is when he would require a steel plate to be put into his head. Later on, he would suffer from horrific pain, of course, but also he would have periods of blackouts, and this affected him for life, which is scary, but also what the fuck? What caused that? People who knew him then and later on thought that this could have been the head injury that caused some of his erratic and even violent behavior throughout his life. This period of time in Ken's life was said to be the very last attempt he made to live a quote-unquote normal and straight-laced life. Oleta and Ken would move back to Missouri at some point, and after this, Ken would end up right back where he started with his thefts and running the streets to make a quick buck instead of working a legitimate job. He would first start off with stealing livestock from various farms that were ready to sell to a market and process. As Ken was roaming the different parts of Missouri, stealing or angling to make fast cash, there were rumors back in Skidmore, or really anywhere he went, about what the ruffian, Ken McElroy, had allegedly done to people. There were stories of rape, alleging that Ken had at some point in his life raped a 14-year-old girl who would become pregnant and then died while supposedly giving birth to twins at her own house because she was too poor to go to the hospital. Unsure if that's true or not. Another story being talked about was how Ken had yet again raped another girl a year after the death of the 14-year-old. In fact, it was allegedly her older sister. It was sort of a known fact that whenever Ken McElroy was around, at least during the more party times in his life, that there were said to be lots of alcohol, times of violence, and also sex. At some point in time when Ken was said to be about 20 years old, not only was he hanging out with a kid who was like 12, but he was also known to frequent bars, playing pool or other bar games. At the time, Ken was said to be a good-looking young man who was muscular, had darker hair, and blue eyes. One source would say that the girls around the age of 17 or so all thought that he was handsome, and there was always seeming to be ladies around Ken. One young woman would go on to say that he had told her that she, at 17 years old, was too old for his taste, that in fact he liked his, quote, women, young and tender. I like that young meat, end quote. Ugh. When he used the word women, he was actually referring to girls that he preferred around the ages of 13 or 14. Gross. That's not a woman. That is definitely a child. In fact, at the age of 21, a 14-year-old girl named Donna would end up giving birth to a son of Ken's. After the shooting of Ken, his wife Trina, who had been sitting next to him in the truck, would say that her husband was not known to have ever bowed down to anyone. This, according to a newspaper article in the Tampa Bay Times. She would say that Ken wasn't afraid of anyone, and whether or not he had someone standing beside him, he didn't care. He never backed down. However, Ken wasn't really known to get down and dirty when it came to street fights. Instead, it seemed to most that he didn't really need to come to fists, but rather, he seemed to take pure joy in sparking fear into others' hearts and minds. He was calculated, cold, and wasn't afraid to flash his gun in order to strike that fear. Ken would be described as someone who liked to stalk his prey, and most people would wish that it was not them that he would set his gaze upon silently, scary. As he had gotten older, he would dye his hair jet black to seemingly keep his youthful look. He was also said to be muscular, but now overweight, at 5'10", 265 pounds with thick eyebrows and some sideburns to boot. It was known throughout the town that there was a pattern of sorts when it came to Ken's behavior in the law. Ken would do something to break the law, he would be arrested, taken to court, and let go. It was always like this, as far as anyone could remember. He was never really kept for long when it came to the shit that he pulled in this town. The townspeople seemed to hate Ken, and were desperate for him to move away or get in trouble enough that he would be locked up for good. He was a bully, a nuisance, and everyone in town knew exactly who he was. During the time that Oleta, Ken's first wife, and him moved back to Missouri, Ken started a relationship of sorts with a 15-year-old young woman named Sharon. On one particular evening while Sharon and Ken had been fighting in his truck, she would allege that Ken got upset and pulled a gun on her, saying that if she kept talking, he was going to shoot her in the head. Now, no one knows if the next part happened on accident or on purpose. You guys can decide for yourselves, but somehow the gun went off and hit underneath Sharon's chin, which luckily didn't kill her, but left her with some scarring for the rest of her life. I don't know if it grazed her chin or what, but she's definitely lucky to be alive, that poor thing. So after the shot went off, the authorities came and Ken was going to be charged with assault with a deadly weapon. Well, Ken is no dummy, so he called upon his wife, Oleta, and told her that he needed a divorce and would quickly marry Sharon to avoid the charges. Luckily for Ken, Oleta would agree to the divorce and Sharon would become his second wife. In July of 1959, Ken and Sharon also had a son and eventually a daughter. The marriage was said to be contentious. Sharon seemed to try and leave on a few different occasions, but would always end up back with Ken at some point. She would later report that Ken had beaten her when he was mad and needed to get away. Long story short, she was taken to foster care with her and Ken's daughter. Turns out, Ken and Sharon's son had been taken to California with one of Ken's sisters for whatever reason. When the time came for charges against Ken for the abuse of Sharon, everything was set up and the warrant for Ken's arrest was ready to go. All that needed to happen was for Sharon to sign it. Unfortunately, Ken would figure out a way to be allowed to see his wife, or he would talk her into coming back to him, promising that he would get their son from California if she did. This sadly worked, and as Sharon got home that evening with their daughter, Ken, of course, beat her. Not long after, Ken would be known to have gotten close to a young girl who was just 13 years old. He threw her out of his car one night, and witnesses said she was screaming and bleeding, and her clothing was torn. Before she was able to do anything, Ken got to her and threatened to kill her or her family if she didn't do exactly what he told her to do. So, of course, at 13, what are you going to do? She then ended up moving into the household with Sharon and Ken. It would later sadly be alleged that while the three were living together, Ken would beat them both regularly and force them to have what the younger girls described as violent sex, and he would even use objects on them. Eventually, the younger girl would end up having 3 children with Ken, all the while his wife was also continuing to have their children. There was said to be a time where they were both pregnant at the same time and had given birth around the same time. These poor girls, what a sick fucker to put them through all of this that he continued to do to them and forcing them to do sexual things that they didn't want. Not only is that domestic abuse and or rape, but then having children with this man must have been so scary and confusing to these young girls. Brainwashing in a domestically abusive relationship is a real thing, let me tell you. It's not as easy to leave as people often say to do, especially when you throw a child into the mix. I wonder if the girls relied upon each other for support and comfort. I mean, at least they had each other, right? I suppose that is one light in an otherwise dark household full of pain and tears, not having to go through it alone. Eventually, the younger girl was sort of done being abused by Ken, and she was able to break away and take her 3 children and move to another city. Sadly, her children would be taken from her after an incident where she was gone, and the authorities didn't feel like the drunken partier kids who were there babysitting were responsible adults, and they took the children. Ken was still making whatever kind of living that he could, stealing livestock like cattle, hogs, and even dogs off of various farms and selling them. He had now been thought of as a man who most likely ran some sort of thieving ring, and where a group would also steal grain off of those elevators that contained them as storage. Ken was said to have multiple places in where he would stash away the stolen goods, keeping him from being caught, even though the authorities were already onto him. Now, around the time that Ken was 26 years old, he would meet his next young wife, a 15-year-old girl named Alice Wood. About 3 years after having met Alice, Ken would leave Sharon and move in with the then 18-year-old, Ken being 29. Yikes. It was said that Alice had grown up without ever having known her father, grew up with an alcoholic stepfather and her mother, and eventually she ran away from home at 13 and moved in with a friend. I can tell you from my own experience, not knowing, meeting, or even seeing the face of my own father until I was 13 years old, and then having shitty stepfathers, that it will continue to fuck you up in ways that you don't even understand until you're older. As bad as it is, it doesn't actually surprise me that Alice went for a much older man, filling the role of a loving older man in her life. It's just sad because I know how those types of stories go. Poor Alice. Of course, this relationship would be like the rest, with Ken getting to do whatever he wanted, but with the girl expecting to be home, waiting for him, regardless of how many hours, days, or weeks he was gone. If she stepped out of place or didn't do what he wanted, she would be beaten. Poor Alice would also have to learn to live with the fact that Ken was never going to be faithful, having women all over the place that he ran around with. Sadly, Alice would later say that she kind of knew when Ken had a new girlfriend because he seemed calmer and would be nicer to her, which breaks my heart. Eventually, Alice too would give birth to a stillborn baby, which is just so sad, and then would go on to have a son with Ken. Ken's lifestyle never really seemed to get better. In fact, it got worse and more violent. There would come a point in his early 20s where Ken was busted for theft and violence, where it said that he ended up with over a dozen felony charges, closer to 20, I believe. He was able to evade so much of his trouble catching up to him by either delaying his cases long enough for him to get to the witnesses and threaten them, they would disappear, or Ken would learn that if there is not a witness, they didn't have a case. In fact, this would be put to the test during an incident that involved Alice's father. So eventually, Alice was able to get away from Ken, fleeing with her child back to her parents' home. Whenever this would happen, Ken would call and threaten to take their child away and never let her see him again. Usually, this was enough to bring her back to him, but not this time. This time, Alice said they weren't coming back, and if he tried to come take their son, she would be ready for him. Apparently, Alice had gotten a pistol out and was going to sit in the kitchen and wait. Her plan was to shoot Ken on the spot if he came into the house, but instead she had an accident. As she was loading the pistol, the gun would go off, Alice having been shot in the leg. She was taken to a hospital, and this is when Ken would call the house telling her father that he was coming up for their son, to which the father said, "No, you're not." Eventually, when Ken showed up, he would end up shooting her father in the leg. After he was going to be charged with assault on Alice's father, he would stalk, harass, and use scare tactics, trying to get her father not to testify in the case. He threatened his family's lives and would be found driving behind them in town and showed up intimidatingly at places they would go. It got to the point where they all feared even going outside because they all knew that he was watching them and they were afraid of what he would do to them. Finally, Alice's father had enough, and while he was at a bar one evening drinking, Ken showed up, gun in hand, threatening the father and even holding the gun to his face. There were people in the tavern who saw all of this happen, as Ken had locked the doors and told the owner they were closing for a bit. Alice's father stood his ground and kind of thought he was going to die. Ken was threatening the man that if he testified, he was going to kill him, and even took a shot at the ground before leaving in a huff. The authorities would come and Ken would be arrested and given bond. Ken was going to be charged with a felony when it came to the gun and basically tampering with a witness, but for some reason it was dropped down to a misdemeanor and would be like attempting to bribe a witness. But when it came time for trial, eventually all of the witnesses and even the owner of the tavern had suddenly changed their minds and claimed to have not seen what Alice's father was claiming. This is the case where Ken would find the lawyer that he would use for some time to come. He definitely would need one again. Ken would testify that he did indeed have a gun, but only because he had plans to sell it to someone there, and he had forgotten that it was loaded, and the gun had gone off by accident. It didn't matter. The judge found Ken guilty and sentenced him to 6 months in prison. However, Ken would file an appeal that would have automatically given Ken a new trial, but for some suspicious reason, Ken's file on the case were sealed the very next day, and that only happens if the charges are dismissed or if the defendant is acquitted. Alice's father would endure 2 more years of harassment because there would be a new trial, and eventually he would tell the prosecutor that if he wasn't going to try the case, then just drop it because he was sick of living this way and was said to have never heard what happened to the case after that. So these incidents were just kind of giving an example of what Ken was like. You know, his personality, the bully type man who seemingly had gotten away with everything in his life by threatening people or harassing them into whatever he wanted. He liked younger girls, would, at least in the statutory way, rape them, keep them like trophies, and then drop them. Some he would keep for himself in his home where he would use and abuse them. He wanted them to always be on command for his every whim, and if they strayed from that, he would beat them. He is just a straight-up piece of shit human being. Now we get to his 4th and final wife, Trina. Trina didn't have the best start in life. Her father up and left his family one night, never to be seen again, with her mother telling her that the reason he left them was because he didn't want her anymore. Awful. Then the mother would also take off, leaving Trina with her grandparents. Eventually, the mother would marry a man and bring Trina back to their new home when Trina was 7. Trina was said to be a sweet, young girl and was usually happy with her best friend. Things seemed to be going normally for Trina for a while, until her friend would say around 8th grade. Trina at the time had a boyfriend who had taken her to a school dance, and Trina was playing sports as well. Then, things started to go downhill for her, as she started ditching school and started to get into trouble as well. This was around the time that Ken McElroy was seen in his truck waiting for Trina when she was getting out of school. Now, at this time, Trina was said to be 12 or 13 years old because the year was around 1969 or 70, and doing the math, this means Ken would have been like 36 years old. This fucking pedophile deserves to have his dick cut off. I'm just saying. I hate him. So it was said that sometimes when Trina would get off the bus at school, Ken would be waiting for her in his truck and she would go with him instead of going to school, and then she would be dropped back off to ride the bus home. Students would claim that Trina's clothes were all messed up and that she would be crying on the way home. It seemed everyone felt so bad for her. The kids tried telling her to stop going with Ken, but she never did stop. At first, I guess Ken had taken her shopping and bought her gifts and candy and stuff, then eventually he started taking her to a hotel and molesting her instead. How horrible for this little girl, how confusing and sad. And this is just another girl that he is taking advantage of who doesn't have their father around. What a sick sack of shit. During Trina's freshman year, she was only 14 years old. She would become pregnant and ended up dropping out of school. I guess at this time, the school counselor of wherever Trina went was fucking pissed that this was happening. She had heard different rumors about Ken taking Trina, and she couldn't understand why the school or the authorities weren't doing something about it. Which, same. Yeah, what the fuck? Apparently, her smaller stepdad did try to stop everything. It was said that he even took her out of school a few times, but what can he really do? He can't be with her 24/7, and let's face it, Ken was a scary dude with the means to hurt someone. After Trina had given birth, it had only been a short time. In fact, the baby was still in the hospital, and Trina asked Alice for some help escaping Ken. Trina's stepfather tried to help out, of course, but Ken found out, figured out where they had been taken to, and showed up with a shotgun in hand. Alice and her 2 children and Trina and her new baby were all running for their lives trying to escape this horrific man. When he got to the place they had gotten safely, he screamed at them, calling them names and telling them that if they didn't come out, he was going to go in and kill them both. He was demanding his favorite child to be brought to him, this being him and Alice's son. Of course, scared to death, Alice brought the boy out and Ken put him in the car. After this, Trina was called out on demand, and Ken warned if she didn't come out and talk to him, he would kill everyone inside the house. Why were the cops not called right then and there? That's so terrifying. Eventually, Alice and Trina would both go with Ken out of fear for themselves, their children, and the nice people who were trying to take them in and get them away. Once they all got back to the farm, Ken would make his point in the way of shooting his gun within just a few inches of Alice's legs, and of course, a beating. Ken that night would break both of Alice's cheekbones with a blow to her nose with the barrel of his gun. When she was able to get away, she went to a hospital with her face gashed, and for this, she would suffer with headaches for life. And so, this is who Ken McElroy was at the heart of his personality: a tyrant, a tormentor, a rapist, a pedophile, and eventually attempted murderer. A few of the events that would lead up to that fateful day on July 10th, 1981 were nothing less than terrifying for the receiving party. Besides the fact that Ken at some point in his life had been charged with over 21 felonies over his lifetime, he always managed to be released, let go, or would intimidate his way to freedom. One incident on July 27, 1976 would involve a farmer named Romaine Henry, who had heard some gunshots while he was working on his farm, and when he went to investigate, he would find Ken waiting for him holding a shotgun. When Ken would ask, quote, "Were you the dirty son of a bitch over at my place in a white Pontiac?" Henry would tell Ken he had no idea what he was talking about. This is when Ken would raise his gun and shoot Henry in the stomach. As Ken pulled the trigger again, Henry was doing his best to get the fuck out of there as fragments from the shotgun hit his cheek and forehead. Luckily for Henry, Ken's gun then jammed, and Henry was able to flee in his truck to safety. When Henry's wife took her husband to the hospital, Ken was then arrested and charged with assault and intent to kill. Ken's lawyer did the same thing that he always does by delaying this trial over and over and asking for a change in venue. And while these worked in court, Ken did what he did and intimidated the Henry family consistently. When trial came for this incident, 2 neighbors would testify that they saw the shooting suspect take off from the scene, but Ken's lawyer came with his own witnesses. He brought in 2 hunters who were willing to testify that they were with Ken, far away from the spot of the shooting during the time. The jury acquitted. The last straw when it came for the citizens of Skidmore came on April 25, 1980, when a few of Ken's kids went into the local grocery store called B&B to buy some candy. Something would happen at the register. One source would call it some confusion when one of the younger girls started walking out with her candy that had not yet been paid for. According to an article by David Karjasek, sorry if I butchered that, this is when an older man who owned the store and his wife, named Bo Bowenkamp, hollered at the children about the unpaid-for candy. It was said then that the oldest of the McElroy children, who was there, was embarrassed and got angry, snatched the candy from her little sister and threw it back on the rack as the little girl whose candy had been taken started crying. They left in a huff, but within seconds, the older sister, who was upset, came back and yelled at the clerk that no one accuses her little sister of stealing something. Bo and his wife Lois had tried talking to the children about the incident, but nothing was resolved. In fact, the teenage girl, who was now pissed, said they were not going to shop there anymore, and Lois said they were banned from the store. Bold of her, really, considering who her father was. Like clockwork, within 20 minutes of this conflict, Ken showed up at the B&B along with his wife, Trina. Ken was said to have been wielding a pocket knife, and Trina was said to have been cussing and threatening to kick Lois's ass. Bo then tried to explain to the angry couple that they had not accused their children of stealing, but that their daughter had gotten upset when he told them about the candy that hadn't been paid for. This seemed to help. At first, both Ken and Trina seemed to relax a little bit about the situation. Ken then asked for a pack of cigarettes, and Bo refused him. He said their family was banned from the store, which, again, is bold of him standing up to this bully in their town. That same night, Ken was sitting in his truck that evening staring into the store, watching, waiting, festering. That night, he took to driving past the Bowenkamp's home again and again, and when they called the sheriff told the elderly couple not to worry about Ken, that he wasn't going to do anything to them. Which really shows the kind of bullshit that Ken was allowed to get away with. I think history would show that Ken most likely would do something about it, given a chance. He wasn't exactly known to back down from a fight or a problem. It was reported a few days later, Ken was trying to give Lois $100 if he would fight his wife. Is this real life? This sounds like a fucking cartoon. Like, who does that? Bo Bowenkamp was like 70, so his wife couldn't have been much younger. And if Ken was 46, then Trina had to be like 22 or 23, wanting to fight a woman, most likely in her late 60s. Really? Of course, Lois told him it was ludicrous. The next day, both Ken and Trina were waiting outside of the Bowenkamp's home, seemingly waiting for Lois to come out and fight Trina. The Bowenkamps called the police, but I guess Ken had a police scanner, so they took off before anyone got there. Not long after this, Ken would show up one evening, about a month after the incident, at the grocery store holding a shotgun and fired 2 shots into the air. Then he got back into his truck and left. While the Bowenkamps went to the sheriff's office asking for a report to be filed, the sheriff said he would file one with the local prosecutor, which never happened. He never filed anything, never talked to Ken, never did anything about it. The people of Skidmore knew all about Ken McElroy, his legend, his children, his abuse, his intimidation, and no one seemingly wanted any part of the conflict between the Bowenkamps and McElroys, which is completely understandable. Who would ask for that crazy shit to enter their lives or threaten their families? 2 nights after the first shots at the Bowenkamp's house, Ken would do it again. On July 8, 1980, Bo Bowenkamp went to the grocery store after hours to meet a man who was going to repair the store's air conditioner. As Bo was breaking down boxes, seemingly waiting on the repair to be done, Ken showed up at the back door of the store. Bo and Ken exchanged words, and at some point, Ken was holding a shotgun at him. As Bo tried to scramble away, Ken squeezed the trigger, and Bo crumbled on the floor. A local boy would quickly find Bo bleeding horrifically and called an ambulance. When an officer was on the scene, he asked Bo who had shot him, and Bo would tell him it was Ken McElroy. Ken was arrested a few hours later, but would only spend 1 night in jail as his lawyer got him out the next morning on bond. Bo Bowenkamp would survive his wounds, but of course that wouldn't be the end of this incident. Ken was already doing what he does best, harassing and intimidating Bo about the trial that would inevitably take place. There was said to be a minister who was brave enough to go to the Bowen camps and try to help them with just the simplest of things, sympathy. Not long after, he himself started getting threatening phone calls. The Bowen camps were desperate for someone, anyone, to help them. Lois would even write letters to the state legislators, the attorney general, and the governor pleading for help and telling him their situation, with the ongoing harassment and intimidation that they were living in complete fear. During the wait for the trial, even the local cop was threatened by Ken with a shotgun to the face, due to the officer potentially having to testify against him. The officer escaped the situation without harm, but when he would radio the sheriff's office about what had just happened, the article by David Krajicek would say that he was told, quote, "Don't provoke him, nothing we can do, keep an eye on him," end quote. Similar to what the Bowen camps were told by the same sheriff's office. Dunbar the next morning turned in his badge and quit, as he had a family and he didn't get paid enough to live in his own type of fear. As the trial was growing nearer, Ken's lawyer did his usual with delaying trial, etc., but this time it actually did go to trial on June 25th, 1981. The prosecutor, who happened to be brand new, served up a good case, while the defense, meaning Ken's sketchy lawyer, brought out more quote-unquote witnesses who allegedly said Bo Bowenkamp lunged at Ken. Ken was convicted of the assault, and when it came to sentencing, the jury wasn't allowed to know about any of Ken's past charges because he was never convicted, meaning his record was like clean. So they gave him a second-degree assault charge, which is like 4 years, instead of life, which he could have been looking at. Ken was sentenced to 2 years and was released on his bail still because I guess he had some appeal window of like 25 days. So Ken was free right after the trial. Only a few days after the trial, Ken and Trina were in the D&G Tavern, and Ken was apparently brandishing, according to the article in the Tampa Bay Times, an M1 rifle that had a friggin' bayonet on the end of it. What? Who the fuck does that? Anyways, Ken started spouting off at the mouth, saying that he was going to shoot Bo Bowenkamp in the head, and was said to have murmured something about carving up the old man like a damn turkey. A local farmer had enough, and not only got his sons and a group of other men together to watch and protect Bo Bowenkamp, but also reported the rifle incident to the police, where the prosecutor was trying to get Ken's bail revoked. Here, he had a man who was out on bail for the assault that could have actually ended in the murder of Bo, but now the same man is bragging with a rifle in his hand that he was actually going to murder the man. For this, the judge could have immediately grabbed Ken and threw him back in jail, but of course he didn't. Instead, the judge, Ken's lawyer, and the prosecutor decided that July 10th would just give Ken 5 more days of freedom, and that would be the day of revocation. This brings us to July 10th, 1981. When the hearing for bond revocation came, some 60 people showed up to the hearing, hoping that the sheer volume would show the judge just how important this was for the townsfolk. Unfortunately, they would be disappointed, as they had heard the words that the hearing would be set back, delayed again for another 10 days because Ken's lawyer had a conflict, of course. After this, many of the citizens of Skidmore headed to Legion Hall to have some kind of secret meeting and asked the sheriff to join them. As they were discussing Ken McElroy and people were complaining and upset about the case, someone would come bursting through the doors telling the people who had gathered that Ken was in town. Now, usually when this happened, anywhere and almost at any time, people would disperse. No one wanted to get caught in the wake of just what Ken was going to do that day. But this time, it was different. This time, instead, the small group went over to where Ken was with his wife Trina, the B&G Tavern. As Ken had finished his beer and headed towards the truck with his wife, the crowd gathered around the pickup. This is when 3 shots would be put into the head of Ken McElroy. The town had had enough. The town was done being terrorized, done being bullied, done being harassed, and done with waiting on law enforcement. Although there were said to be over 40 witnesses to the shot that would finally put an end to the problem that would never go away, apparently no one had seen who had done it, or at least that's what they said. Trina, on the other hand, knew exactly who the shooter was and told the authorities as much. The townspeople had their story, and they stuck to it. No one had actually witnessed who shot Ken McElroy. The authorities had 35 people who they brought in for questioning, all holding potential leads, and not one damn person will say a word about anything. They all seemingly had similar stories. They didn't see who pulled the trigger. The prosecutor would convene a coroner's inquest, which is basically a public hearing, where they try to find out more information about facts surrounding a death. The purpose is to find out when, where, and who, of course, and with it came a 6-person jury. The jury, however, would find that Ken McElroy was killed by a, quote, person or persons unknown. After this, a grand jury from another county would look into the case. 3 weeks later, the grand jury, 12 jurors, to be exact, would hear over the span of 15 sessions from all the witnesses, Romaine Henry, Bo Bowenkamp, and even the 2 men that Ken had been accused of shooting in the past. Trina McElroy would name a young farmer, the son and also a co-owner of the D&G Tavern, as having been holding a rifle after the shots rang out and she jumped out of the truck. However, the forensic evidence would show that Ken would have wounds from a .22 caliber gun and an 8mm rifle. All of the witnesses sticking to the fact that they hadn't seen a damn thing when it came to the shooting. Not who had done it, and not even the direction the bullets came from. It would be concluded that there wouldn't be enough evidence to bring the case to trial, and that would be the end of it. And that, my friends, is the story of Ken Rex McElroy, pedophile, abuser, town bully, and all-around piece of shit. What a freaking story, right? I love how this town just took their vigilante justice to their damn graves. Hell yes, that motherfucker had to go. I mean, I feel really bad for his children because it's not their fault that their father was a horrific human being, and it even sounds like his shitty ways started to rub off on some of his 17 children. Yeah. There are documentaries and books out about this case, and I'm sure there's other podcasts about it as well. Some of the resources really dive deep into the townspeople and how they stuck together, and how they all stuck together, and the investigation into the murder of Ken. It's really interesting stuff. If you get the chance to check it out, you totally should. I feel the worst for the women now, but young girls who were raped by, forced to marry, and beaten by this monster. They didn't deserve that. And although Trina was seemingly close-knit with Ken, I couldn't help but think that she wasn't at many times in her life. And after all of the abuse and fear, of course she was. Poor thing didn't deserve a lifetime of what he put her through, and I hope that she was able, along with all of the other women in his life, or people affected by this shitbag, able to find happiness in their lives and feel that feeling of freedom after being terrorized by Ken. That gut-wrenching feeling and anxiety that comes with that type of harassment and fear of what comes next is one of the worst feelings in the world. It doesn't let go, and it keeps you from enjoying things in your life. It's awful. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this case as much as I did, and I hope to see you guys back on Monday for our regularly scheduled episodes here on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today's Hidden Files. Do you have a story that you want me to cover? Please submit it on the website, TheKillFile.com. And while you're there, take a look at the merch website for some fun true crime merch and to help support the podcast. Have a comment or something to add? Follow us on the Kill File's social media platforms. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to help boost the podcast where others can find us and listen as well. I hope to see you guys next time here on the Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.